Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. Lately, on my blog, BuriedSecretsPodcast.com, I've written a lot about the connections between the paranormal and nostalgia. So, if you're a frequent reader of my blog or newsletter, I'll be retreading a little bit of ground here, but I've just found this question of what is the connection between the paranormal and nostalgia? Are we interested in the paranormal because we're nostalgic? I've found that question endlessly fascinating. And the more I think about it, the more I think that there's something there, right? From the technology that we use to investigate the paranormal, which tends to be tech from the 80s and 90s, to the interest in a forgotten past that often encourages us to investigate the paranormal, and so much more. I'm so fascinated by some of the potential reasons behind why we're interested in the paranormal. So at one point, famously, interest in the paranormal was mostly driven by a desire to talk to the dead. That's why spiritualism became popular following the Civil War, and that's why it had a major resurgence after World War I and the 1918 flu pandemic. People wanted to communicate with their deceased loved ones, so they turned to the paranormal. They could be comforted by seances and the words of often fraudulent mediums. The desire to talk to the dead became such a trend that it literally became profitable to fake it, right? Nowadays, I do think that some people turn to the paranormal after they've lost somebody and, they want to either learn more about what sort of afterlife there might be or communicate with that person. I think that is still in play, but in most cases, I don't think that people get into the paranormal to talk to deceased loved ones. I think that many of us are looking for something else. We live in a world full of chaos and uncertainty, and we're looking for something that can soothe us or give us meaning. Because being a person is stressful and it can be hard to cope. I'm not one to defend organized religion or to say that people need to have a religion. However, religion can provide a sense of meaning, purpose, and comfort. And it's something that at one point in history probably helped many people deal with the stress of daily life. And I think it still does today. Faith fills in a lot of gaps in human knowledge, such as what happens to us when we die, or whether we can speak to the dead. Organized religion, however, has been losing followers for some time now. As of 2019, 26% of Americans identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, a number that's gone up 10 percentage points since 2009, so in a 10-year span. So in the absence of widespread religious belief, what do people turn to? If you'll forgive me for quoting a writer who is a shitty person, but who nonetheless said some smart things that are still worth reading and talking about, I've never been able to get part of David Foster Wallace's speech, "This is Water," out of my head. And I wanted to read an excerpt from that because it's all about finding meaning in the grind of daily life. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship, and the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it JC or Allah, be it Yahweh or the Wiccan Mother Goddess or the Four Noble Truths or some other inviolable set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. On one level, we know this stuff already. It's been codified as myths, proverbs, cliches, epigrams, parables, the skeleton of every great story. The whole trick is keeping the truth up front in daily consciousness. So in this speech, he talks about the importance of choosing what you focus on and being aware of the things that we unconsciously think and do, because even when we're unaware of what motivates us and what we believe, something is still driving us. we still believe in something because as humans, we kind of have to in order to continue functioning. So it's not groundbreaking to suggest that an interest in the paranormal is linked to religion or spirituality. Some paranormal investigators bring their faith into their work explicitly. Some folks are agnostic but find spiritual meaning in the paranormal. And, way back in the 19th century, when spiritualism arose, it became a religion that still exists today. That's all well-trodden ground, but I'm interested in the comfort that belief in a religion and or the paranormal can give people. Because while I think that venturing into the weird can be spiritually fulfilling, I'm even more interested in the other ways that it can be comforting, which maybe are less important to us as humans, but which still motivate us hugely in our daily lives. So let's talk about nostalgia and comfort. In times of chaos and uncertainty, it is natural to use nostalgia as a way to cope. This has been well documented. There's plenty of ink that's been spilled about that. But anecdotally as well, I certainly notice myself self-soothing with nostalgia. I watch YouTube videos about Frutiger Arrow, which is that sort of 2000s tech aesthetic that was very popular during a formative time in my life. I also watch YouTube videos about things like The Secret Life of a Fax Machine, and I watch tons of retro computing videos where people, get machines from the 80s and 90s running again. I find that I have a particular interest in nostalgic tech, which I will loop back into. But in addition to my tech nostalgia, I also dig through old newspaper archives and read old books that are considered paranormal classics and literally try to talk to ghosts of the past. And if you are a longtime listener of this podcast, you know that I am very concerned with history as much as I am the paranormal. And, I would be lying to myself if I said that nostalgia wasn't a huge part of my interest in the paranormal. And I don't think I'm the only one. Looking for ghosts can be fun. There's this sense of childlike wonder, a concession that there's something that exists beyond the mundane world. And there's also the treat of getting together with friends and doing something that's not mediated by screens and that doesn't involve consuming media products manufactured by corporate conglomerates. Our ideas about the paranormal might be shaped by horror movies and paranormal investigation TV shows, which tend to be serious and gritty, but there is an element of delight, optimism, and creativity inherent in the idea of looking for unseen things, digging into history, and analyzing the things that you experience in the physical or at least non-digital world. Also, many people my age and younger grew up on paranormal TV and are nostalgic for the shows they loved when they were younger. There's also the trope of teenagers telling urban legends and watching horror movies when they're not supposed to, and kind of that whole realm of horror entertainment has a really strong connection, I think, for a lot of us with the memory of being a kid or being a teenager or, just growing up. Take something like a Ouija board. The only times I've really used Ouija boards, like with a group of people until fairly recently, the last few years, is, high school or middle school sleepovers, hanging out with friends and sort of engaging with the paranormal because it feels sort of transgressive. And I mean, I grew up in the Bible Belt, so maybe in some parts of the country and some parts of the world, that is less of a edgy teenage thing to do, but it certainly was, growing up in the South. And I think that no matter where you are, there have been enough horror movies and such about Ouija boards that it does feel kind of like you're playing with fire, when you're a teenager using them. So all of this to say, while investigating, some folks may be invoking these memories of hanging out with friends when they were younger. And I think about these parties I went to when I was growing up, and it's very easy to idealize those times, when you're younger and have fewer responsibilities. And the most transgressive thing you can think of is like sneaking out to a cemetery after curfew. There is something kind of endearing about that. And I think as an adult, it's so easy to kind of fall into a trap where when you hang out with people, you're just like getting drinks or getting dinner or whatever. And going on a paranormal investigation is so much more interesting and fun and kind of offers more of an opportunity for connection and bonding than, going to a restaurant does. So I think there's something there. I also think that it's very possible that, consciously or not, plenty of people my age or younger might be acting out or reinventing something that they once saw on television and making it their own and tailoring it to their specific neck of the woods. But there is kind of this element of mimicking or imitating or being inspired by paranormal TV shows that people may have grown up watching. So nostalgia is something that people turn to during difficult times. And the paranormal is something that tends to bubble up during times of liminality. In his book, The Trickster and the Paranormal, George P. Hansen wrote about this phenomena where paranormal things tend to occur in moments of transition and change. And he writes about our discomfort with the liminal and about ghosts' liminal nature. So to read a bit from that, ghosts are liminal, interstitial creatures. They exist in the netherworld between life and death, and they challenge the idea that there's a clear separation of the two. The dread evoked by such beings can be profoundly disturbing. I totally think he's right, but I also think there's a sort of inverse to that, where in times of chaos and uncertainty, sometimes it's nice to engage with something else that's like chaotic and hard to explain. So, I think depending on who someone is and what their needs are, maybe it's a little of one, a little of the other. Maybe some people are attracted to the chaos of the paranormal and others are attracted to the nostalgia elements. But either way, given all of that, it totally makes sense that paranormal weirdness bubbles up alongside a desire for nostalgia because of how they're linked to liminality, uncertainty, and change. Earlier, I mentioned how so much paranormal investigation gear is retro tech, particularly tech from the 1980s and 1990s, which people my age and older are likely to feel nostalgic about, like millennials and Gen X folks in particular, I feel like have a lot of nostalgia about 80s and 90s tech. I'm not the only person watching all of these YouTube videos about people refurbishing old computers. These things have hundreds of thousands of views. So I'm not the only nostalgic one. So let's look at some paranormal investigation gear that fits this bill. So first, ghost boxes are just modified radios. Vintage recorders like the Panasonic RR-DR60 sell for upwards of $5,000 now on the secondhand market because they're said to be better at picking up electronic voice phenomena than new recorders. And of course, the ever popular instant camera is a classic late 20th century piece of tech. I know they were invented before that, but when I think about Polaroid cameras, I think about the 1980s and the 1990s. So why do paranormal investigators tend to favor old technology? Does the act of using old tech add to the potential allure of ghost hunting? Does our own feeling of nostalgia somehow help to evoke the weird? A feeling of really deep and visceral nostalgia could almost be considered a sort of altered state. So just like you might try to get into a meditative state before contacting the paranormal, maybe we're also trying to get ourselves into a nostalgic state, just without realizing it. One thing that I haven't talked about too much, but that I think is also at work in our interest in the paranormal, is the fact that the paranormal isn't online. And I know there are exceptions to that. You can do all sorts of paranormal stuff using modern technology. I know the Liminal Earth folks are doing really cool stuff with AI spirit contact. You can do all sorts of stuff with tech. But in general, the classic paranormal investigation where, you go to a physical location, you have your spirit box, you have your recorder for your EVPs, whatever. It's all about you inhabiting a physical space. which is very different from this sort of non-local, always online vibe that so much of our lives tend to be these days. So maybe we are interested in the paranormal because we distrust the algorithmically generated, constrained, surveillance-filled online worlds that we tend to find ourselves plunged into. It's very different from our online lives. But at the same time, I do think we have an innate faith in machines. And so I get this vibe sometimes that we're trying to avoid what we think of as contemporary technology, the gruesome trappings of Web 2.0, which is defined by digital enclosure, walled gardens, social media, and really intense surveillance. But at the same time, for whatever reason, we have faith in machines for paranormal investigation. We're using spirit boxes and recorders and cameras. And there's this strong sense that paranormal gear is necessary for investigations. While I'm a fan of some sorts of technology in paranormal investigations, for example, I enjoy the popular Estes method of paranormal investigation, which uses a spirit box, but I believe that the human mind can access the weird without the help of technology. However, technology often acts almost as a magic feather, something that helps us have faith in our own psychic experiences. We can validate the things we feel because we used a machine in the process. That raises a lot of questions, like why should we trust a machine's output over our own perceptions? Why do we so often feel like we're more limited than the machines that we use, which are, I would say, obviously more limited than we are? Like, I think the human mind can do so much more than any machine, any computer, and any AI can do. So, this is a big question that I can't answer, but I think that part of it is that we're taught to trust machines and science because they're objective, in quotation marks, right? Never mind that anything made by a human can be just as biased as a human, whether it's a machine, an algorithm, or a scientific study. We've been told that the machines are objective, and as our lives move increasingly online, we've had to put our trust in technology on a societal level, kind of whether we like it or not. But even if you want to roll back the clock and think about prior to the internet or whatever, since the Enlightenment, we've been told that the human mind is flawed and inaccurate, and the dogma of science and machines are always better than the human mind. To me, I think both things can kind of supplement each other and can work well together, but we're so often told just not to trust ourselves. And I think that's in play when it comes to paranormal investigation gear. So where does this leave us? As faith in organized religion wanes, many of us are looking for new things to comfort us. As our lives move online, we feel unmoored spiritually and physically. As daily life and the state of the world makes us increasingly anxious, we turn to nostalgia as a balm. Looking for the paranormal gives us physical destinations to visit and a set of spiritual concepts, but we can still use technology and the scientific method. So when we investigate the paranormal, we tend to lean on those. And when we choose what technology to use, coincidentally or not, we use technology that we remember from our childhoods for people, my age or older, or technology that evokes a sense of anemoia, which is nostalgia for somewhere or somewhen that we've never been. Anemoia is a fairly new word coined by the poet John Koenig in 2012, who compiled the book Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. It feels particularly apropos that the term came about in 2012, a year that I've always felt represented a bit of a turning point in terms of our relationship with technology and with nostalgia. But I would argue that people younger than me are definitely motivated by anemoia when it comes to the paranormal and the tech that we use. And in fact, Gen Z aesthetic trends are what inspired me to look into the connections between the paranormal and nostalgia at all. In particular, I'm fascinated by the internet aesthetics of liminal space, cryptid core, and cryptid academia, all of which lean heavily on nostalgia. And I guess to back up a little bit, internet aesthetics are like typically images that people share on sites like Tumblr, Pinterest, Instagram, like platforms that are focused on visual content. And there's these different aesthetics that people have come up with that make it easier to, search or follow hashtags with the type of images that you like. So anyway, liminal space, which I've talked about on the podcast before, but the liminal space aesthetic shows, restaurants and malls from the 80s and 90s, old playgrounds, suburban neighborhoods, a lot of images that I remember from my childhood, especially from, the 90s. Cryptid core images lean heavily on X-Files and Twin Peaks vibes. A lot of, 80s and 90s vibes. So old recorders, cassette tapes, mass market paperbacks, camcorders, that sort of thing. And cryptid academia is pretty similar, but it leans more heavily on the imagery of mid-20th century researchers and reporters like John Keel. And there's more of a focus on dusty libraries, typewritten manuscripts and newsletters, and smart vintage clothes. And I found that I was coming across these aesthetics frequently online. And, I am also an artist and I do a lot of research on Pinterest for different things I can draw on, different inspiration. And I kept coming across these three aesthetics a lot and thinking about what it means that they're so popular and so nostalgic and so tied with the paranormal. So let's look at some specific retro paranormal investigation tech. And in this episode, I think I'm just going to talk about spirit boxes. So spirit boxes or ghost boxes are radios that have been modified to sweep AM or FM stations at a swift rate. Radios have been used for paranormal investigation for a while. In 2002, Frank Sumption came up with the first modern ghost box, the Frank's box. In the late 2000s, shack hacks became popular. People would basically just modify cheap Radio Shack radios so that they would work as spirit boxes. For the record, I have tried to do that with a couple cheap radios that I bought on AliExpress, and so far I have not been successful in modifying them. I do think you need a particular type of radio, but I have taken apart a couple radios lately, and it is easy to take apart a radio and modify it, I will say that. So that's how spirit boxes came about kind of in the early days, and as TV shows like Ghost Adventures popularized the use of spirit boxes in paranormal investigation, purveyors of paranormal gear began selling more expensive, purpose-made spirit boxes. Nowadays, when you search for info about shack hacks, you'll likely come across a lot of websites from 2009 or so. There's not an enormous amount of information about more modern-day equivalents of shack hacks. I think just because people are buying spirit boxes pre-hacked. So, though many paranormal investigators carry an SB7 spirit box these days, which is the model that I have as well, the ghost hunting device is still just a humble old school radio. It's just been hacked by the person selling it rather than the person who bought it. So it's very easy to forget that it is just a radio. To me, everything about the spirit box's origin reeks of nostalgia, again, for someone my age at least. For example, shack hacks, the term came from Radio Shack because that's where these radios were purchased. Radio Shack was a once successful retail chain catering towards electronics hobbyists. The company had its peak in 1999, began to falter in the 2000s, and finally declared bankruptcy in 2015. Radio Shack still exists, kind of, but it is a shadow of its former self. Honestly, when I was writing this, I looked it up and I was shocked to find that they were still around at all. I have really clear memories of going to Radio Shack when I was a kid. There was one in the strip mall next to the grocery store. And while it never had the allure of larger electronic stores that sold all these different types of computers and stuff, I still remember going into Radio Shack and looking at their wares, such as radios and landline telephones. They had some very cool clear phones, I remember. And who could forget the novelty items that Radio Shack carried, like Roby, an animatronic robot piggy bank. I had one when I was a kid, and it was delightful. So, Radio Shack, is already a very nostalgic thing. And to me, radios inhabit the same nostalgic space as landline phones, which are, one of the other nostalgic items I mentioned. Radios are an old device, a remnant from a technologically simpler time. We've since replaced most physical gadgets with apps. Streaming apps like Spotify and internet radio stations have rendered radios nearly obsolete. When was the last time most people used an actual radio to listen to a terrestrial radio station, aside from possibly in an older car? I'm not exactly a Luddite, I'm pretty into technology, but I do sometimes find myself waxing nostalgic about the days when we were surrounded by physical gadgets rather than just, a cell phone that does everything, as nice as smartphones are. But there is something nice about being able to take something apart, see how it works, and fix it. If you had a radio back in the day, you could try to repair it yourself. But if you encounter a glitch in a streaming music app nowadays, you can go through a whole troubleshooting flow, but you're trying to fix something that's mostly invisible, out of reach, and wrapped in code that you can't access and, of course, stored in a faraway cloud data center. There's an immediacy to old tech that it's hard not to feel nostalgic for. And maybe that's one reason why physical gadgets are so popular when ghost hunting. When you're searching for something as immaterial as a spirit, it's nice to feel grounded by holding a simple, easily understood physical machine. In addition to that, ghost hunting apps are notoriously unreliable and known for putting their thumb on the scale, leading to inaccurate results. Part of that is their sheer opacity. It's hard to trust a random developer to write code that doesn't say favor scary sounding outputs in the hope of pleasing their users. But I don't think that's everything. I don't think that's the only reason why people tend to want special paranormal investigation gear and not just their phones. And, these days, spirit boxes are the only sort of physical radio that I hear people discussing frequently. And I have to ask myself, when people use vintage tech like radios to communicate with ghosts, are they hoping to conjure conversation with spirits? Or are they trying to evoke a sense of nostalgia or anemoia or, most likely probably both? All right, so that's what I've got to talk about this time. I am sorry that this episode was delayed by a week. I was sick last week and wasn't able to record, but I'm feeling a lot better this week. Next time, I am going to talk more about nostalgia and paranormal investigation. I have a lot more to say. Surprise, surprise. So stay tuned for that. And like I said, I have been writing about this stuff on my blog, which is at buriedSecretspodcast.com. And I also cross-post those posts to Medium and send them out on my Substack. So you can sign up to receive them in your inbox, either on Substack or directly from my website. I have an email list there. Or you can just use an RSS feed for the blog on my website. I have lots of options. I, for the last couple of months, have been writing a blog post daily, or, every weekday. And my goal has been to try to refine my ideas, kind of have a faster feedback loop, and kind of just quickly share paranormal information. So a lot of it is like notes on stuff I'm reading, weird stuff I've found. Like this week I posted about Allan Kardec, who was a French spiritualist. I posted about his spirit classifications that I, of course, stumbled upon while reading this publication that he wrote in French. So I kind of translated it and put the notes up on my blog. And I say translated very loosely because I'm quite bad at French, and also found an English translation of something else that he wrote that was similar that I cross-referenced. I also write about kind of weird random stuff. Like I wrote about this creature called the Naga that is not real, was invented by a marketing campaign, but for a while people seemed to think that this was a real animal. And that was just a weird story that I came upon. A lot of the stuff that I talk about on the blog are ideas that I'm working out or information that I haven't quite figured out how to put into an episode. But I've been having a lot of fun writing there, so you can check that out. Also, of course, the show notes for this episode and every episode are also on buriedsecretspodcast.com. Also, I suppose it's worth mentioning, I think either last week or the week before would mark the 3-year anniversary of me doing this podcast. I can't believe I've been doing this for 3 years. Also, I started this in April 2020, so the last 3 years have felt like a weird funhouse mirror or something. I'm just imagining like the climax of the 1940s film The Lady from Shanghai, where there's, a very cool sequence filmed in a funhouse and Rita Hayworth is stumbling around and it's terrifying, and I feel like that's been the last 3 years for everybody, right? But I really appreciate every one of you who has been listening and stumbling through this funhouse full of mirrors with me for the last 3 years. It really means a lot to me. Other than that, you can follow me on Mastodon at Buried Secrets Podcast at weirdo.network. You can follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast, though of course I don't like Instagram as much as I like Mastodon, which is where I'm most active right now. You can write to me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. Please rate and review it on your podcatcher of choice, especially Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Please tell your friends about it. And thanks so much for listening.